We're going to get underway here. I put up the agenda for the meeting, and we're going to start with the welcome and the roll call. I just want to point out to everyone that this is a hybrid meeting. We have people here at 25 Beaver Street, which is the meeting location, and we also have people online, including some of the voting members. To speed up the meeting, if you're online, you can depress your space bar if you're muted to unmute and then release it to mute again. So that may speed up things a bit. And then finally, the materials for the meeting are available here at the sign-in desk, and they're also available online on the NYMTC website. Having said all that, I want to turn the meeting over to Ian Francis to welcome and call the roll. Ian?
Thank you, Darren. Good morning. My name is Ian Francis. Today I'm representing Craig Rule, the Regional Director of New York State Department of Transportation, Region 11, as the New York City Transportation Coordinating Committee Secretary. I will now call the roll by agency for today's executive meeting. Principal voting members and representatives who are present should state their names in response, and representatives of principal voting members should state their names and who they are representing. I have all the proxy letters from your representative principals. I'll start first with the voting members. New York City Department of City Planning.
Good morning, Jack Schmidt, representing City Planning Commissioner Daniel Garodnick.
Thank you, Jack. Second, the New York City Department of Transportation.
Dennis Rodriguez, Commissioner DOT.
Thank you, Commissioner. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority.
Olu Falare, representing Chairman and CEO General Labor of MTA.
Thank you, Olu. And I am representing the Department of Transportation. My name is Ian Francis again. Now, the advisory members. New York City Department of Environmental Protection. Okay, let's move on to the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Representative of Port Authority. Okay, next, the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. The Federal Transit Administration, followed by the Federal Highway Administration, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Okay, all right. By my count, and under the current New York City Transportation Coordinating Committee operating procedure, we have a quorum for today's meeting. I will now turn the meeting over to New York City Department of Transportation Commissioner, Dennis Rodriguez, the Chair of NYMTC.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Dennis Rodriguez, and I'm as you say, I'm the New York City Commissioner for the Department of Transportation, the first Latino being a commissioner, the second one of the two commissioner of color, and one of the things that I always say that I share with my leadership at DOT is that I'm the first working class commissioner. I'm the first commissioner born and raised in another country, living since 1983 in equity in a community that have been left behind for so many decades. So it is an honor to be here sharing with so many leaders and institutions the present and the future of transportation. New York City has been making many great accomplishments in the transportation field, in part thanks to the men and women who home maintain and keep our transportation running, but also because our city has had a great leadership and the city believe in continuity. And is standing today in the shoulder of so many previous commissioners. I know that the Mayor Adams also is standing so many previous mayors who believe that New York City has a great opportunity to continue turning ourselves as a most walkable and cyclist city in the whole nation. Working under the leadership of Mayor Eric Adams, we have made it clear that when it comes to investing and improving the state of transportation system, we are going to be focusing on those communities that have been historically left behind. And the Mayor Adam has been also putting his mouth where his commitment, his money where his mouth is. He increased 80% of our budget. He increased $1 billion additional to DOT so that we can have all the resources that we need to redesign danger intersections. And under President Biden and U.S. Secretary of Transportation, cities across the nation have been seeing enormous amounts of investing in our infrastructure. Challenge that we have is, where is that money going? Is that money going to the same community that for decades have been receiving the investment over and over, or are we addressing our investment from the perspective of equity? This is the future of our city. COVID can kill anyone, but most people who die, they die because of pre-health condition. They die because they didn't have access to public transportation. They died because they were dealing with asthma and obesity. They didn't have the bike lane, bus lane. They didn't have safe street. And those are areas where we will see major investment happening because of the commitment from the city, the state, and the federal, at the federal level. I'm proud to be working alongside our state and federal partners to continue improving the state of our city transportation system. And we must continue to view these investments through an equity lens. We need to make all alternative modes of transportation accessible to all New Yorkers, regardless of the socioeconomic or ethnic background. Today, I'm proud to be joining you all from Boston, where I will be giving a presentation at the NACTO conference to discuss our city progress in expanding bike lanes and reimagining of the use of our city streets. Thank you all for having me. Now I would like to turn to our next agenda item and pass it to Jerry Gogarts for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. We're going to be acting on this as part of the adoption process for NYMTC's next Transportation Improvement Program. We're going to be focused on the New York City project listing of that TIP. And I'm going to give you an overview now of what that program means, particularly in light of the additional funding that's coming to our region through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act at the federal level. So a little bit about NYMTC for those who may not know, although everybody in the room who's a voting member does. NYMTC is a metropolitan planning organization. It covers New York City, suburban Long Island, and the lower Hudson Valley. As an MPO, as that's known, NYMTC is a regional council of governments, basically, made up of 9 voting and 7 advisory members. It's required by the federal legislation that makes funding available in order to be eligible. There are over 400 of these councils in the country and metropolitan regions for that purpose. And it's responsible for the mandated planning process that the federal law basically says has to be followed in order to bring federal money into a region. And this is the area that we cover. We are subdivided into 3 transportation coordinating committees, or TCCs, one for the lower Hudson Valley, one for New York City, and one for Nassau and Suffolk County on Long Island. So basically, you know, the work of NYMTC happens at 2 levels. One is the regional level, and the other is the sub-regional level. And that formula works really well. And this, of course, is a New York City TCC. So Congress funds transportation through multi-year authorization acts. Again, the current one, which was passed last November, is the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. All the surface transportation funding programs are reauthorized under the IIJA, and it both maintains current programs and adds new ones to address existing and new priorities. Usually what happens with the new programs is that rulemakings and guidance are needed to fully implement those programs. So the US DOT has been working on that, and we haven't been able to program all the new money from these new programs until all those arrangements have been made. The second part is once the funding is authorized, every year Congress passes an appropriation act or a series of appropriation acts for each year's budget. And transportation falls under the Transportation Housing and Urban Development Act, which is an interesting acronym called THUD. And so that's how the money actually gets appropriated, even though the multi-year act authorizes funding for, in this case, of the IIJA from fiscal 22 through fiscal 26. And just to illustrate the fact that this act is different, the authorized funding is considerably more than what its predecessor act had been. So this is US DOT funding. This is funding that will come down to metropolitan regions through the various funding programs, among other things. You can see that the FAST Act, which was the predecessor act, that was taken as a base, basically, for the new IIJA, which added almost 100% more to the pot, so to speak. So there is funding out there to do many different things under the IIJA, and it makes this process even more significant, given what we're facing in terms of climate change and the equity issues that are before us. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but there are funding programs that have been increased significantly under the IIJA. This is the Title III formula funding programs, which are generally considered to be highway funding programs. You can see the levels of increase for each of them, and at the bottom there are three new ones: carbon reduction, Protect, which is for resiliency, and the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. Title 49 is for transit programs. Total authorization has been increased by 44%, although the base is smaller than the highway side. And you can see the various sections under Title 49 that address different needs for transit systems. And what's unique about the IIJA also is that there are a number of discretionary competitive programs. These are funding programs that are nationally competitive, and the decision on who gets the funding is made by the Secretary of Transportation. So there's over $100 billion in the IIJA in these discretionary competitive programs, which is unusual. Plus, there, as you can see by this org chart, there are a number of different topics that are addressed by these discretionary programs. So this is a very unique aspect of the IIJA, and we are working with the members right now to be as competitive as we can in our region and forward competitive applications to get as much of this discretionary funding as possible. So this is the process we have to follow, the regional transportation planning process. This makes us eligible, basically, for the federal funding, starting with the regional transportation plan, the orange circle at the top, which is basically the long-range look at the region, and then circling down to, you can see the red circle around the Transportation Improvement Program. This is where the projects basically are identified for a 5-year period. They're identified in terms of scope and schedule and funding sources. And this is the immediate step before the federal government commits to funding individual projects. All of this goes around the left-hand side. It comes up to project planning and implementation. That's the reason we do all this, so we can use this considerable money coming to us to fix roads, to fix bridges, to purchase transit vehicles, whatever is needed in terms of project planning and implementation. The role of the TIP in the planning process is as a 5-year multimodal program. It enables project obligation and eventual federal reimbursement of the costs. And it includes all the surface modes of transportation, so it's not limited to any one. You have transit, roadways and bridges, you have bicycle pedestrian, safety systems and demand management, and you have operations and maintenance projects also. And a TIP is usually developed every 2 to 3 years, and the development cycles are coordinated with the statewide process. The federal government recognizes a statewide TIP, of which our TIP is part. And so during each cycle, existing projects are updated, new projects are programmed, and new fiscal years are added, and mobile source emissions are analyzed for transportation conformity, which is an important requirement under the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. This just shows how the current TIP, which is 2020 to 24, relates to the new TIP. So basically, we're starting with a new fiscal 23 and moving on through fiscal 27. And the funding assumptions are for the formula programs. The federal programs are apportioned to the states. So there's a funding apportionment by formula down to the states, and then for each formula program, New York State defines allocable and non-allocable categories, and the allocable categories are result in planning targets. These are funding targets for our particular part of New York State. The non-allocable funding is managed centrally by New York State for statewide needs. So federal authorizations for each funding program are set by the IJ through September 30th of 2026. Fiscal 27 is just an extrapolation because it's not, that will be in the next Authorization Act. Assume that New York State funding levels are derived from these authorizations, and New York State uses these to develop planning targets for each of its administrative regions. And I just wanted to show you, these are the administrative regions in New York State, and NYMTC's area is part of Region 8 in the Hudson Valley, and it's all of Region 10 on Long Island and all of Region 11 in New York City. So this is how the money does come down into our process and how the members then program projects based on these funding levels. One very big test in the TIP is fiscal constraint, and that requires that revenues and costs are balanced in transportation planning and programming. So we have to identify through the planning targets what's reasonably expected to be available to implement the TIP, and then we have to also program up to only that level. So program project costs must balance with anticipated funding. This is a very strict test. It's a very important test, and it involves a lot of choices and a lot of prioritization on the part of the member agencies to meet this test of fiscal constraint, given all the needs we have in our region. Just some information about the TIP itself in terms of its scope. $36.9 billion is proposed for the draft fiscal years 23 through 27 TIP. You can see that basically the majority of that funding accrues to projects in New York City, which receive both federal and state and local funding for that. Smaller amounts to Long Island and the Lower Hudson Valley. Those amounts basically track to the size of population and the size of travel in each of these regions. And most of the, not most, but the larger part of the funding in this proposed TIP is in the first year, and then that basically evens out over the subsequent 4 years. The federal portion of the TIP is not the majority. It is highly leveraged. So 40% of the current TIP, or the proposed TIP, I should say, 40% of that is to be used federal funding. The remaining 60% is state and local. So this is a highly leveraged program in our region, and we're using local resources and state resources to match, and in many cases overmatch, the federal funding that's coming into our region. But the federal portion is very important to us. And as you see by the number of projects, there's over 1,000 projects in the proposed TIP for 23 through 27. The relative numbers don't equate necessarily to the funding because the different sizes of projects, but we're talking about a very large program, the largest in the state, probably one of the largest in the country, in terms of the number of projects that are programmed and also the amount of money that's programmed. If you just look at the work types, we're not going to go through this in detail, but note that just under $10 billion is programmed for highway needs, and the largest part of that is for bridges. And then $27.2 billion is programmed for transit needs, and that's very significant because we have a very large transit system, and their transit infrastructure is extensive in our region, and the needs to maintain that and also enhance it are great. So the comparison of transit to highway is very, very significant in our region and not found in many other regions in the country. We're probably the most transit-oriented in terms of funding of any region in the country. We do have to visualize the TIP, which means that we have to basically locate the projects that can be mapped on a mapped basis. We have this on our website. This makes it easier for people who are interested in TIP not have to basically look through the phone book. Remember those? But rather to look in their areas to see which projects they might be interested in. So our TIP visualization, which takes a lot of effort by the staff and the members, is one of the easiest features in terms of using this catalog of over 1,000 projects. We encourage everyone to take a look at that online. And finally, we do have to demonstrate how the TIP it will achieve and work towards certain performance metrics that are, again, mandated at the federal level. There is a section, an appendix of the TIP that talks about that in terms of all the performance metrics. We're not going to go into that in detail here, but we do want to be clear that that is part of the TIP and we meet those requirements. So this is the last slide. This shows the development schedule. Back on July 20th, we released the draft 23 through 27 TIP for public review. That comment period ended on August 18th. On August 9th, we had 2 virtual public review meetings, one at 3 and one at 6:30, to gather comments, and comments actually came in through the entire comment period, which we had to look at and we had to respond to, and those comments and responses will be part of the final TIP document. The week of September 5th, this week, we're having the executive meetings of the 3 transportation coordinating committees. This is the second one. Yesterday we had the Lower Hudson Valley. Tomorrow we're having on Long Island. And these meetings are for the TCCs to recommend their project listings for inclusion in INTIC's overall TIP. And then on September 22nd, our Program Finance Administration Committee has to convene to recommend the entire TIP to the council principals, who will meet on October 13th to formally adopt the TIP and the transportation conformity determination that accompanies it under the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. So that's really the end game schedule where we are right now in this development process, which is happening at multiple levels because of the complexity of our region and the fact that we have to have consensus amongst our members on what the program is. Okay, having said that, thank you all for your attention. I'm going to turn it over now to Yogesh Sangwi, who is the proxy for Commissioner Rodriguez, who had to leave to go to give that speech he was talking about. So Yogesh, if you can hear us, we can pick up with registered speakers.
Hi, good morning. My name is Yogesh Sangwi. I, as Jerry said, am representing Commissioner Idanis Rodriguez, who is the New York City TCC chair and the Commissioner of New York City Department of Transportation. Jerry, first of all, thank you very much for the excellent information you gave on the TIP development. The main public review period for the proposed FFY 2023 through 2027 TIP was held from July 20th through August 18th. Comments submitted during that period and responses to those comments are available to the meeting participants and will be included in the final TIP document. We have set aside time in today's agenda for formal public participation. Registered speakers will be heard on a first-come, first-served basis. We ask the speakers to try and limit their comments to 3 minutes if possible. I would ask in-person speakers to please move to the microphone so that your statements will be audible on the video recording. And for those who are participating via the webinar, your line will be unmuted when you are called on to speak. So Jerry, would you be able to assist me to get the speakers to speak?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Yogesh. So we have 3 speakers registered today. 2 of them are on the line. One of them is in the room here. The first, I don't know if we've located Assembly Member Inez Dickens on the webinar, but if we have, you can unmute her line, or she can raise her hand electronically and show us where she is. Fidel, anything on the Assembly Member? Okay, so we'll go to the second speaker. That would be Mary Bowden of Concerned Grandfathers. Grandparent, I'm sorry, yes. And Mary, if you can use the podium, that would be great.
My name is Murray Bowden. I have a little bit of dementia, so if I make a mistake, please correct me. Today is a day that has been no other for most of you because of what you're going to hear. The Port Authority has a team that is developing a modification for the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices for LaGuardia Airport, so that when a driver looks up, he knows that the yellow line is on the left and the white line is on the right. The parts where lanes split will have a dotted lines going to a solid double white line, so that aggressive drivers, if they cross that solid double line, will get a moving violation and not just a ticket, which they ignore. That will go on their driver's record, and there will be a police car up ahead to ticket a moving violation. Aggressive drivers have taken advantage of everything they knew they could get away with. And crossing that neutral area, but you're shaking your head yes, so you know, right? What it does is make everybody who's paying correct attention and following the rules, it creates road rage. We get mad when we see somebody cut ahead of us. And it can be stopped, and it will be stopped. Port Authority built a new terminal, it's beautiful. And some of the drivers have been taking advantage. Happened to me this morning. Somebody rode up beside and cut me off. So this is the day when that Federal Highway Administration manual on uniform control devices will be modified legally and quickly. It does not have to go through rulemaking. It is the decision of a traffic engineer who documents it legally, and it will be installed within days or weeks. I was at a webinar for the Federal Highway Administration, and they were presenting the information that they're going to make the lines on the road reflective. Shut it. Right, Jerry? There's no enforcement. What made me start with this is some Cleveland had 16 crosswalks all painted in the, stop shaking your head, Jerry, somebody encouraged me. You know that. There's 16 crosswalks painted in tan colors or gay colors. Are crosswalks traffic control devices, or are they roads advertising or road art? Crosswalks are meant to make it safe for pedestrians, period. They are not road art. Every crosswalk has to look the same to the driver. New York City has that. Every crosswalk in New York City is the parallel bar, continental style, much of the rest of the world. But when you paint it with street art, it doesn't protect the pedestrian because the driver doesn't notice it. Oh, the gentleman there, what's New York State DOT? They use the ladder crosswalk everywhere instead of the bar, and no matter what I tell you, our department, you insist on using the ladder crosswalk, which is not the safest for the driver. And you want to have zero accidents until you, as New York State's representative, change the crosswalk to a bar crosswalk. You're killing people. Now, I've told you directly to your face on the record that if you don't change New York State's crosswalk to what New York City uses, Connecticut uses, California uses, to a bar crosswalk, you're responsible personally for a number of deaths. This is recorded. I know I'm recorded. Everything I say is on a recording. Your card says, global warming is everything. It also says, trust nothing I say, check it out yourself. There is a record that you have personally been notified that New York State uses the ladder crosswalk and it's killing people. It's your responsibility to go back there and say, we're going to use bar crosswalks everywhere. Now, if that isn't a statement making you personally responsible, I haven't done my job today. This is a world that we leave to my grandchildren. I have assistance from grandparents or people who care about children today. We're worried about children starving. By using that crosswalk that New York State can't stop using, they're killing people. This is the first time I had the guts to do it on camera, that it can be searched and be seen everywhere. I can't do it. I'm 89 years old. My health is failing, and don't ask me how I am, because if you want the truth is, I'm losing it. This is a momentous day in my life. I hope you all pay attention. Change the crosswalk. Make the lines on the left yellow so drivers know where to go. You got autonomous cars that are driving themselves. Don't make the computer look everything up. The less the computer has to look up, the safer the driving. And for those of them, I didn't do all this, I didn't learn all this myself. A lot of people took the time to mentor me and teach me this. And I thank everybody, you know some of the people, Jerry, who taught me. Thank you all for teaching me. I've learned as much as I can, and I have made mistakes. I've learned from them. To the best of my ability, I don't repeat my mistakes. Thank you.
Thank you, Murray. All right, the third speaker is Felicia Park Rogers with the Tri-State Transportation Campaign, who is online and I think has been unmuted, correct, Fidel?
Yes.
Felicia, can you hear us?
Okay, how about now?
You're good. Excellent. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Felicia Park Rogers. I'm Director of Regional Infrastructure Projects for Tri-State Transportation Campaign, which is a nonprofit organization fighting for sustainable mobility in the New York City metro area and the region. Today, I'm testifying to oppose the inclusion of the Van Wyck Expressway widening project in the final draft of NYMTC's TIP. Expanding the Van Wyck Expressway is an expensive way to not solve a problem. Time and time again, we've seen that when cities add urban freeway capacity, it actually results in more freeway travel and does not reduce congestion. Induced demand has long been proven out by the data. Yet New York is still spending billions of dollars doing it. With transportation emissions the #1 contributor to global warming, we must promote low carbon forms of transportation wherever possible. Highway expansion does just the opposite, incentivizing the most destructive behavior for both the environment and our city. Sometimes what we don't build is more important than what we do build. New York should rethink any plans to add freeway capacity and consider reducing capacity instead, as many cities have done, to create new healthy public spaces and reconnect neighborhoods that were destroyed by highways. We encourage New York State and NYMTC to follow the issued guidelines from the FHWA to use flex funding to fix it first, improve transit, add greenways, bicycle, and safe pedestrian routes, rather than to expand this highway. We should be decommissioning freeways, we should be investing in lower impact modes of transportation, and we should be redefining transportation beyond highways. Even if there's still traffic around the city, people will need to have more options to avoid it. If New York is going to have any chance of meeting our short or long-term climate or clean air goals, it's imperative that we get people out of their cars and onto a train, bus, bike, or their feet. But this will only happen if we stop expanding highways and instead focus our efforts on making it easier for people to drive less and live more. TSTC strongly urges NYMTC to reevaluate its project list and remove projects from this transportation improvement program, including the Van Wyck Expressway and Route 17 expansions that are not in the long-term interest of the city and region. Thank you for the opportunity to share these comments with you. I'll be happy to answer any questions and follow-up conversations.
Great, thank you very much for the comment. That is the end of our list of registered speakers. However, I do want to just circle back and see if we've, Assemblymember Dinkins is on the line. If not, we will move on. Okay, cannot locate the Assembly member, so we will move back to Yogesh Sangvi. Yogesh? Yogesh, are you there?
I'm sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Jerry.
Sure.
We will now move on to the action items. The resolution and previous meeting synopsis we are about to act on are all available on NYMTC's website, www.nymtc.org. They are also available to the executive committee in your meeting packages. The first item in the synopsis of the first item is the synopsis of the last executive meeting on August 21st, 2021.
That's 19.
Oh, I'm sorry, 2019. Yeah. Since this is a hybrid meeting, I would ask those making or seconding a motion or voting to state their name and the agency they are representing. Do I have a motion to accept the meeting synopsis?
So moved. This is Ian Francis, New York State DOT.
Thank you, Ian. Do I have a second?
Olu Farare, representing MTA chairman, I so second.
Thank you, Olu. Is there any discussion of the meeting synopsis? Hearing none, is anyone opposed to accepting the meeting synopsis? All right, the motion passes. The next action item is resolution NYC.2022.1, which is the recommendation of the New York City project listing for inclusion in Federal Fiscal Years 2023 through 2027 Transportation Improvement Program. Carl King, as NYMTC's New York City TCC Staff Supervisor, will introduce the resolution. Carl?
Thank you, Yogi, and good day, everyone. Everybody hears me clearly?
Yes.
You're very good.
Great. Okay, I'm introducing New York City Resolution NYC 2022-1. It is for the recommendation of the New York City project listing for inclusion in the Federal Fiscal Year 2023 to 2027 Transportation Improvement Program. And as was noted earlier, the NYMTC is the Metropolitan Planning Organization for New York City, suburban Long Island, and the Lower Hudson Valley. NYMTC, in cooperation with New York State and any affected public transportation operators, is responsible for developing a TIP for the metropolitan planning area that reflects the investment priorities established in a current regional transportation plan with no less than 4 years. NYMTC is developing the 23-27 TIP to take effect during federal fiscal year beginning in October 1st, 2022. The listing The project listing for the federal fiscal year 5 boroughs 22 have been developed in accordance with the federal regulation and requirements in cooperation with the state, regional, and local officials, as well as with the active participation of the public. Proposed project listings in the 5 boroughs of New York City have had a public comment period, but 30-day comment period. Now, therefore, be it resolved, the New York City Transportation Coordinating Committee recommends inclusion of the FFY the project listing into the FFY 2023 to 2027 Transportation Improvement Program, and that the Secretary of New York City hereby authorizes that they transmit the project listing for adoption by the Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. Do I have a motion to accept the resolution?
Motion, Jack Schmidt, New York City Department of City Planning.
Thank you, Jack. Do I have a second?
Second, Ian Francis, New York State Department of Transportation.
Thank you, Ian. Is there any discussion of the resolution? We will now vote by roll call. New York City Department of City Planning.
We vote yes.
Thank you, Jack. Metropolitan Transportation Authority.
Yes.
Thank you. New York State Department of Transportation.
We also approve.
And I, Yogesh Sanghvi, will vote yes for New York City Department of Transportation. The motion passes. We will now turn to our final action item, the selection of a new chair for the New York City TCC. For the joint TCC operating procedures, the TCC members have unanimously selected New York City Department of City Planning Director Dan Gorodnick as the next TCC chair. Jack Smith, who is here today representing Director Gorodnick, would you like to say a few words on behalf of directors, on behalf of the director? Jack?
Sure. Director Gorodnick asked me to convey that we are thrilled as the Department of City Planning to be the next New York City TCC chair, and he looks forward to working with all of the members to further all of the initiatives of the TCC.
Thank you, Jack. So our formal agenda for today's meeting is concluded. Do any of the members have any other business to discuss? Hearing none, I'll move to the next item. Do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Olu Falarin, Mr. John.
Thank you, Olu. Do I have a second?
Second, Jack Schmidt, New York City Department of City Planning.
Thank you, Jack. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, is anyone opposed to adjourning the meeting? The motion passes. This ends the meeting.
Thank you, Yogesh.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Yogesh. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.